Remember what President Obama said? Remember what the Secretary of the Treasury said, Timothy Geithner? If we don't raise the debt ceiling, we're going to default on our debts. There you go. It's a Ponzi scheme. The Treasury told our creditors that you are the low man on the totem pole. That if we can't borrow more money, we're not going to pay you back the money you've already loaned us. Now, remember, this is what we said would happen if we imposed our own lending standard, because the debt ceiling is a self-imposed limit. But think about it this way. What are we going to tell the world if the world says, we're not going to lend you any more money anymore? Well, okay, then we're not going to pay you back the money you've already loaned us. That is a Ponzi scheme. America will pay interest on its debt as long as it can borrow more money to do it. And we will pay principal on our debt as long as somebody will loan us the money to repay that principal. But the minute people stop loaning us money, we're not paying anybody. That's exactly what Bernie Madoff did. There's no difference.
Time for one more question.
Oh, there's a lot of questions.
Let's go for a few.
Okay.
Why did you set up an office in Montreal, and how do you see the Canadian situation?
Well, we had a couple of individuals here in Montreal that wanted to join the firm. They lived in Montreal, had a pretty good book of business, and so it seemed like a good opportunity to have a Montreal office. We started in Toronto, but the reason that I expanded up into Canada was because I had been developing quite a following up here in Canada. A lot of people in Canada were reading my work, they were seeing me on television, they were following me on the internet, so I began to develop a pretty good following up here, and I thought that that was a good market potential for people who also might want to utilize my brokerage services. And since, again, this is part of the problem with government regulations, because of the security regulators, I'm not allowed, as an American brokerage firm, to take an account for somebody who lives in Canada. So people would call me up, and they'd say, hey, I'd like to open up an account with you. Well, I'm sorry, government rules say I can't do business with you. So we ended up opening up a firm in Canada so that we can comply with the laws, so that Canadians can legally do business with me. Only they're not doing business with me directly, they're doing it indirectly through a firm with which I have an ownership interest and which follows my investment philosophy.
And what about the Canadian situation?
What about it?
Well, how do you see the future? Like, are we?
No, I mean, Canada is not in the predicament of America. America is unique in the structure of its economy. I mean, if Canada had been issuing the world's reserve currency for 50 years, you'd probably be just as screwed as we are. But, the world gave us a lot of rope, right? And so we hung ourselves with it. Canada didn't get all that rope. In fact, you guys were in trouble a while ago, and you dealt with it. Because, you had no choice. Politicians had to start cutting back because the Canadian dollar was going down. There were some people were starting to realize that, hey, every country, New Zealand has done it, Sweden has done it. I mean, a lot of countries that had too much government had to change. They had no choice. America hasn't had to make that decision yet because we've had a choice. Keep borrowing. The world will let us do it. And so we've developed this crazy economy that no one else can have. An economy that's totally dependent on foreign capital, on foreign money so that we can spend, and on foreign goods so that we have something to buy. And so we've been able to run an economy that's basically a service sector. But it's really easy to run an economy when you don't need factories. When you don't need all that equipment. I mean, all we have to do is open up a storefront and put a cash register in there. And that's all we do. I mean, all we do is sell all the stuff that everybody else makes. But that's not viable because eventually the people who are selling us stuff want to get paid. And when they realize that, hey, we can't pay, and America is happy to continue this charade indefinitely. You just keep sending us stuff and we'll pretend that we can pay for it. But at some point, that vendor financing is going to come to an end, especially when the vendors realize that they're not really financing, they're giving. Right? The world is giving us stuff, because if we're never going to pay for it, then it's a gift. And I think most people, it's not charity. The Chinese aren't sending stuff here because they're feeling charitable. They think they're getting paid. I mean, we got them conned, but they're waking up.
I know you can't give specific investment advice, but what are you telling your U.S. clients right now? You're very good at pointing to the problem, but what's the solution for a U.S.
Well, I tell my U.S. clients
without getting into...
Yeah, well, to divest. If I think the dollar's going to go down, I don't want to own dollars. I don't want to own any U.S. debt. I tell people to buy gold. I tell people to buy silver. I tell people to buy natural resources, commodities, stocks. I invest money all around the world to get out of the U.S. one place is Canada. We have exposure to Canadian, resource companies, mining companies, oil and gas companies, even, just we own REITs up here, or utilities up here. I own bonds. I own Canadian bonds for clients. But that's a small part of the overall portfolio. We've got money in Scandinavia. We've got money in Australia and New Zealand. We've got money in Southeast Asia. We have money in Europe.
If the U.S. collapses like you're predicting, wouldn't it have a worldwide effect, and all values would collapse?
Well, no. I mean, if I think the dollar is going to collapse, it's going to collapse against other currencies. It's not so. So the dollar. So if you have money in other currencies, you're going to be better off if the dollar loses value relative to those currencies. Now, what you're saying is, if the U.S. stock market collapses, would that bring down other stock markets? Probably. But to what degree, and then how quickly might they recover? But I'm not necessarily thinking the U.S. stock market is going to collapse. I think in real terms it will, but in terms of dollars it won't. Nominally, U.S. stocks could go up, even as their real value is imploding. The Dow has lost over 70% of its value in the last 10 years if you price it in gold. The Dow has gone from 40 ounces of gold to 7, or less than 7, and it was over 40. That's going to continue. But I also think that the global economy net is going to be better off after the U.S. collapses than before. Because I think the real problem for the U.S. economy is the cost of propping us up. I think all of the resources that are having to be diverted from productive economies to America to finance its consumption, that is the burden that the world is bearing. And I think if the world stops doing that, I mean, imagine if we weren't selling $2–3 trillion worth of treasuries every year. Imagine if the world had all that money back, that instead of buying all these treasuries, they did something else with that money. So what would that do? How much better off would countries be if they invested that money productively in their own economies rather than loaning it to the U.S. government to squander it? And imagine how much better off consumers in other countries would be if their currencies rose in value so that oil prices were coming down, food prices were coming down. See, prices are going up all around the world. If the dollar collapsed, for some people, prices would be coming down. And so, their standard of living would be rising. So I think the world is going to be better off. Are there going to be certain companies that will suffer? Yes, of course. There are companies that are doing almost all their business in America. And if Americans are too broke to buy their products, or they're already too broke, but if they lose the subsidy, which enables them to pretend that they're not broke, then yes, some companies are going to suffer. But some of those companies will retool. Maybe there's a company in China that's making American flags. Okay, so they start making Chinese flags. Maybe they'll and if the Chinese don't want flags, then they'll make something else. The machines and things. When you have a factory, when you're producing stuff, you can retool. You don't have to make exactly what you're making now. You make a little bit of an investment. In America, during the Second World War, our factories were going 3 shifts a day, and all they were producing was bombs and tanks and planes and ammunition and all sorts of stuff for the war. Meanwhile, American citizens couldn't buy anything. Everything was rationed. There was nothing to buy because all of the factories, all the raw material was producing stuff that exploded. Right? So there was nothing for consumers. Well, when the war ended, it wasn't like we had a complete economic collapse because the factories shut down because there was nobody buying their bombs anymore. In fact, there were actually economists that argued that we couldn't end the war because it would collapse the economy because we had a wartime economy. The fact of the matter is, the economy boomed when the war ended. In fact, that's when the Depression ended. People think that the Depression ended when we started World War II. No, it ended when we finished World War II because then government spending collapsed. And now all those factories didn't have to make bombs anymore. They could retool and make sewing machines and refrigerators and washer dryers and automobiles and stuff that consumers actually benefited from. So the same thing is going to happen in China. The Chinese have all these factories making products for Americans. You don't think they can make products for the Chinese? It's the same thing. And where are the Chinese better off? Making products for us or making products for themselves? Clearly, they're better off. People say, well, there's no demand in China. That's nonsense. You think some guy, some Chinese guy in a factory, and let's say he's making dishwashers, and he goes home at night and he washes dishes by hand, you don't think he wants one of those dishwashers? Of course. Why doesn't he buy it? Because he can't afford it, because his currency is too low. Well, stop, let the currency go up and he'll buy. And that's what happens. I mean, people buy things as prices go down. You get this nonsense all the time from the government that, oh, we can't have deflation because no one will buy anything if prices fall. That's nonsense. Falling prices creates demand. That's the reason we have things. I mean, everybody in this room has a cell phone. You know, did everybody have one when they first came out with 2020, when the first one was like $2,000 and it was like this big? But somebody bought it. Yeah, somebody wanted to be the guy say, hey, look what I got. I got this $2,000 phone. And you know, but how many people would have bought cell phones if the price kept going up from there? The reason that we all got them is because the price came down. Same thing when plasma TVs came out. They were like 10 grand, 20 grand for a TV. Who bought that first TV? Bill Gates? Somebody bought it. But most people didn't buy it because it was too expensive. But as the price came down, more and more people bought. And that argument that, well, no one is going to buy because if you wait, it'll be cheaper. No, because there is a utility in having something now. If somebody simply said, oh, I'm not going to buy a laptop computer because next year it'll be cheaper, okay, so what are you going to do for the next year? Have no computer? No, I mean, you want to have it now. I mean, we all buy stuff knowing that if we wait, it would be cheaper because we don't want to wait. The only reason you're waiting is because you can't afford it. It's like, gee, I would love to get that laptop computer, but I can't afford to pay $2,000, so you wait. And that's the beauty of capitalism. It brings costs down. And companies, they say, oh, companies will never make money during deflation. The television companies are making a lot more money selling plasma TVs at $600 or $700 than they were at $10,000.